Across the far edges of the ancient world, where Roman roads thinned into dirt tracks and the familiar standards of the empire vanished behind distant hills, soldiers often discovered something far more unsettling than the enemies they were trained to face. They met landscapes that seemed alive, forests that whispered in languages older than Latin, and deserts where the horizon itself played tricks on the mind. Men who marched confidently through the marble streets of Rome found themselves hesitating at the borders of shadowed valleys, at the mouths of windswept passes, and at the edges of silent rivers that marked lands Rome had mapped but never truly understood. Legionaries who had once stood unshaken in battle found their thoughts drifting at night toward the stories carried among the ranks, rumors of spirits in Germania's forests, strange lights drifting above the Celtic moors, and the way a desert wind could mimic the cry of something hunting just out of sight. The bravest veterans admitted privately that the further they moved from Rome's stone walls, the more the world felt untamed, unpredictable, and ancient enough to swallow an army without leaving a trace. And tonight, as we walk with them through these forgotten frontiers and explore what Roman soldiers truly feared in foreign lands, settle in, dim the lights, and prepare for a journey across the ghostly edges of the empire. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. The long roads of the empire were more than lines carved into earth and stone. They were arteries through which soldiers drifted steadily away from the familiarity of Roman life and toward lands where maps grew thin and certainty dissolved into rumor. Every legionary understood, at least in principle, that Rome was vast, stretching from the Atlantic shores to the plains of Mesopotamia. Yet no amount of training in the fields outside the city, no inspection from centurions, and no distant tales told in the barracks fully prepared them for the moment when the marble, order, and structure of Rome slowly gave way to the open expanse of territories that lay beyond its heartland. It was on these long marches that the first quiet stirrings of unease grew, not fear of immediate danger, but the subtle discomfort of distance, the awareness of being carried step by step further from everything that felt secure. A soldier marching north from Italy would notice the changes with increasing clarity. The roads remained well built, their stones aligned with Roman precision, but the world surrounding them began to shift. Vineyards and orderly fields faded behind rolling hills of unfamiliar crops. The Latin voices of merchants and farmers slowly thinned until they were replaced by dialects spoken with different rhythms and accents, reminding the soldiers that they were leaving a world where Rome's presence was unquestioned and stepping into regions where loyalty, culture, and customs shaped daily life in ways the capital rarely understood. The architecture changed too. Stone villas gave way to wooden houses, and bustling towns grew farther apart, the spaces between them widening into stretches of countryside that seemed to breathe the older, quieter rhythm of local tribes. For soldiers, the road was both companion and boundary. It held the discipline of marching and formation, the repetition of foot against stone, the weight of armor rubbing against cloth, and the constant awareness of the pack strapped across their shoulders. And yet, even as it held them in its firm, predictable embrace, the road also signaled the gradual thinning of Rome's protective reach. Beyond each hill waited something the soldiers could not yet name, a feeling, a mood, a whisper that suggested the world ahead, operated by rules older than the empire, shaped by forces that did not bend to Roman order. Legionaries were trained to manage physical exhaustion, but the psychological terrain of distance was a different challenge. Days of marching created long silences in which the mind wandered. Some soldiers thought of family left behind in towns they might never see again. Others replayed past battles, comparing the open fields of Italy with the dense foreign landscapes they were heading toward. Veterans who had already served on distant frontiers recognized these feelings well. They had learned that the road's slow pull away from Rome was the first true test of a soldier's endurance. It was in these early stretches that fear accumulated quietly, not the fear of battle, which was familiar and expected, but the fear of the unknown, an unease that expanded with every milestone passed. The roads themselves were masterpieces of Roman engineering, straight lines cutting through mountains, valleys, and forests. But beyond the edges of those straight lines lay worlds that resisted predictability. Soldiers marching through the Alps felt the weight of towering cliffs, their jagged shapes casting long shadows that stretched across the path. The air grew colder, thinner and harsher, carrying with it the scent of pines and distant snow. For those heading toward the northern provinces, the transition from warm Mediterranean breezes to sharp, biting winds was a reminder that they were entering lands shaped by different climates, different stories, and different dangers. In the evenings, after the marching had ended, and camp had been set with the practiced efficiency drilled into every cohort, the soldiers rested beside the flickering glow of controlled fires. The camps were secure, arranged with military precision, ditches, palisades, and watch rotations. But even within these orderly boundaries, the world outside pressed in. The sounds of unfamiliar animals carried through the night air, trees rustled in ways that Italian forests never had, and the sky, vast and clear, revealed constellations perceived differently by the people who lived in the lands ahead. To the locals, these constellations told stories older than Rome itself. To the soldiers, they served as a quiet reminder that they were stepping into territories shaped by their own gods, beliefs, and rhythms. As the road continued its steady pull outward, another fear settled in, the recognition that Rome's authority, though impressive on maps, faded at the edges. In places closer to the capital, the presence of military patrols, tax collectors, and imperial officials was constant, a visible reminder of the empire's reach. But beyond a certain point, those signs grew scarce. Local leaders conducted affairs according to their own customs, sometimes aligned with Rome, sometimes merely tolerated by it. Soldiers heading into such regions knew that while they carried the power of the empire with them, the land itself did not always respond to that power. Roads ended abruptly at rivers or forests. Villages appeared without Roman-style organization, and beyond those villages lay the deep expanses where Rome's influence had yet to take root. This recognition bred a subtle, lingering anxiety among even the most disciplined soldiers. They marched with shield and pack, armor and gladius, trained to respond to commands without hesitation. Yet no training could erase the feeling that they were being carried deeper into lands that were not entirely theirs. The uncertainty was not always spoken aloud, but it existed in the way soldiers scanned the edges of the road, in the way their eyes followed distant riders, or the flicker of movement among the trees. It existed in the heaviness of the night watches, when the darkness seemed thicker and the silence more profound than it ever was within Rome itself. Distance also reshaped time. Days stretched into long sequences of marching, resting, and marching again, blurring into one another, until the soldiers lost sense of how far they had traveled. The milestones carved with numbers became the only markers of their progress. And as those numbers grew, so did the awareness that they were walking into regions where the empire's laws, comforts, and customs gave way to older traditions. For many soldiers, this was the true moment when fear took root, not when they faced enemy warriors, but when they realized how far they had drifted from the world they understood. And so, with every step deeper into foreign lands, the atmosphere shifted further away from the structured certainty of Rome. The road continued straight and unwavering, but the world around it grew wilder, less disciplined, shaped by peoples and histories the soldiers knew only through vague reports. It was within this expanding gap between Rome and the frontier that the first whispers of deeper fears began to settle, preparing the soldiers for the forests that awaited beyond the horizon. The deeper the soldiers marched beyond the last familiar outposts, the more the world around them shifted into something dense, ancient, and entirely unlike the cultivated lands of the Mediterranean. The air thickened with moisture, shaded by branches that overlapped so tightly they concealed the sky, even during the brightest hours of the day. The elevation of the road changed in subtle, uneven patterns, rising over roots that pushed through the earth, sinking into soft patches where rainwater collected long after storms had passed. The sense of distance that had begun on the roads now transformed into something heavier, something the soldiers could feel in the atmosphere as they stepped beneath the towering canopies of Germania's forests. These were not the sparse woodlands found around Rome, or the familiar groves scattered across Italy. Germania's forests stretched for miles without interruption, older than any written history, shaped by centuries of storms, fires, migrations and regrowth. The Romans recorded them with caution in their writings. Tacitus described the region as vast, harsh and shadowed, a place where nature dominated every aspect of life. Soldiers who entered these forests felt that dominance almost immediately. The trees stood like pillars of a forgotten world, their bark dark, their roots twisted, their branches interwoven in patterns that created an unbroken chamber of shade. Some veterans remarked that the forests seemed to swallow sound, as though the air itself absorbed footsteps and voices, allowing only the natural noises, the creaking of branches, the rustle of unseen animals, the distant tapping of woodpeckers, to echo through the expanse. What unsettled the soldiers most was the changing quality of the light. In Italy, the sun guided them, warming their armor, brightening the path, and giving them a clear sense of time. But inside these forests, daylight became fragmented. Long slivers of pale illumination slipped between branches, shifting with the wind and creating a flickering effect on the undergrowth. It made distances difficult to judge. A thicket that appeared a few steps away might be much farther. A path that seemed clear could transform suddenly into a dead end of briars and roots. For soldiers who relied on visibility, order, and predictability, this fracturing of the world into shifting shadow and light created a quiet but constant tension. Unfamiliar sounds deepened that tension. Animals that did not exist in the Mediterranean moved through the brush, their footsteps soft, their calls eerie in the dim air. Wolves traveled in packs, their presence felt long before they were seen. Boars crashed through thickets, with a force that startled even veteran legionaries, their tusks capable of wounding or killing a soldier who did not move quickly enough. The Romans recorded these beasts in their accounts, noting how they created hazards during marches and how their sudden appearances contributed to the soldiers' unease. Even the birds sounded different here, deeper, harsher, or strangely melodic in ways that reminded soldiers they were far from home. But beyond the wildlife and the darkness, there was something else that unsettled the soldiers more profoundly, the knowledge that these forests were sacred to the people who lived within them. The Germanic tribes considered certain groves holy, places where spirits resided and where rituals were performed. Roman writers described these groves with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Some accounts mentioned altars made of stone or wood, offerings left beneath ancient trees, and natural clearings that local tribes believed were watched over by divine presences older than the gods of Rome. Soldiers marching near these groves felt the weight of that belief, not because they feared the gods of others, but because they sensed they were walking through spaces that the locals treated with deep reverence. The idea that the forest itself was alive, conscious or watchful, made even the bravest men feel a subtle creeping vigilance settling in their minds. Furthermore, the tribe's intimate knowledge of the terrain amplified Roman anxiety. Germanic warriors moved through the woods with ease, leaving minimal traces, using narrow paths invisible to outsiders. Their footsteps blended with the natural sounds of the forest, making it difficult for soldiers to detect them. Roman formations depended on open fields, straight lines, and coordinated tactics. Inside these forests, such formations became nearly impossible to maintain. Shield walls lost their cohesion among the trees. Visibility dropped so drastically that soldiers struggled to see even a few paces ahead. This vulnerability weighed heavily on the legionaries as they marched. The thought of enemies watching them from hidden vantage points became a constant lingering fear, even when no enemy was present. At night, the forest transformed into something even more imposing. Fires offered warmth and light, but beyond the glow lay a darkness that felt absolute. Romans were accustomed to stars guiding them, offering a sense of direction and a reminder of home, but the canopy of Germania often blocked even the brightest stars. The absence of the familiar night sky disoriented many soldiers, making them feel enclosed, as if the forest refused to allow light from Rome's world to penetrate its depths. The watch rotations became more intense, with soldiers straining to hear any sign of movement. Often it was only the sway of branches or the hiss of wind slipping through leaves, yet each sound created a tension that settled deep in their bones. Adding to this unease were the stories carried from one campaign to another. Veterans spoke of ambushes that had occurred decades earlier, recounting how entire units had vanished into the forest, how scouts had disappeared without leaving tracks, and how the trees themselves seemed to conceal dangers that no amount of training could counter. The most haunting memory among Roman ranks remained the disaster of the Teutoburg forest, where 3 legions led by Publius Quinctilius Varus were annihilated in an ambush by Germanic tribes. The psychological impact of that event echoed through generations of soldiers. Even those who had not been alive when the disaster occurred felt its shadow whenever they entered a forest in Germania. The mere mention of those losses created a somber stillness among the troops, reminding them that the forest was not merely a backdrop but an active force that shaped the outcome of battles. Yet the danger was not always physical. The isolation inherent in the forest created an internal struggle for soldiers accustomed to the bustle of Roman life. The endless canopy, the silent understory, and the monotony of marching through unchanging scenery could create a sense of disorientation, even claustrophobia. Time stretched differently within those woods, making days feel longer and nights deeper. Soldiers found themselves thinking of distant memories, of home, of the city's sounds and lights, and of the contrast between Rome's ordered beauty and the forest's wild, untamed character. As the legions moved further into Germania, they carried with them the growing recognition that the landscape itself posed a greater threat than the warriors who defended it. Every rustle became a reminder of how little they understood the terrain. Every shadow reminded them of the tribes who called this forest home, and every step carried the weight of an ancient world that did not bend to Roman roads or Roman power. The forest surrounded them, breathed around them, and whispered through the leaves as if watching their progress with a patience far older than the empire. And as they marched deeper still, leaving behind the densest parts of the woods and approaching the mist-laden highlands that lay beyond, the soldiers began to sense that the challenges awaiting them in the lands of the Celts would test them in entirely new ways. Leaving the dense, breathless forests of Germania behind, the soldiers who crossed the northern sea or marched along the long routes toward Britannia encountered a landscape that felt no less formidable, though in an entirely different way. Where the Germanic woods pressed inward with their towering trees and heavy branches, the lands of the Celts unfolded outward into wide, open highlands that seemed at first to promise visibility and space, yet that promise proved deceptive. The highlands of Britannia held their own kind of secrecy, not the concealment of shadowed woods, but the quiet erasure created by mist, marsh, and the shifting contours of ancient hills that seemed shaped by centuries of wind and rainfall. The first thing Roman soldiers noticed as they marched deeper into Britannia was the weight of the air. Moisture clung to armor, clothing, and skin, creeping into the linen beneath their breastplates and settling into the joints of their equipment. The sky rarely appeared fully clear. Clouds drifted across it in slow, heavy movements, often releasing thin veils of drizzle that blurred the outlines of the world. Fog rose from the valleys, even on days that began with pale sunlight. In the mornings it settled thickly across the highlands, drifting in low, cold waves that swallowed paths, streams, and distant shapes. A soldier could stand on a ridge one moment, seeing miles of rolling land ahead, and within minutes the fog could descend, obscuring everything beyond a few paces. This fog unnerved the legionaries more deeply than they wished to admit. Roman discipline depended on clarity, the ability to see one's cohort, to read formations, to understand the terrain. But the mists of Britannia disrupted that clarity, erasing depth, distance, and direction with quiet indifference. The sound behaved strangely within that haze as well. Hoofbeats, footsteps, and the clinking of armor echoed and warped, sometimes seeming closer than they were, sometimes drifting away in unexpected directions. commands carried poorly. Even the natural noises, the faint call of birds, the whisper of wind moving through heather and grass, twisted into murmurs that made soldiers glance into the fog, uncertain whether something moved hidden within it. The land itself added to the challenge. Unlike the structured agricultural fields of Italy or the dense, predictable forest paths of Germania, Britannia's highlands had grown wild for centuries. The terrain was carved into rugged hills shaped by glacial ages, with slopes that alternated between firm ground and treacherous patches of hidden bog. Marshes lay disguised beneath layers of grass, their surfaces appearing solid until a foot pressed down and sank into cold, clinging mud. Roman accounts mention these marshes frequently, describing how soldiers lost sandals, equipment, and occasionally their footing entirely, sinking to their knees or deeper before their comrades pulled them free. To march in such an environment required constant vigilance, and this vigilance heightened the exhaustion of long campaigns. Paths through these highlands were not always marked. Local tribes knew routes that followed natural contours, weaving between hills and avoiding marshy ground, but these routes were invisible to men unfamiliar with the land. Roman scouts attempted to map the region, but the terrain resisted simple classification. Many routes wound unpredictably, sometimes circling back on themselves or disappearing entirely beneath the shifting mists. Others narrowed into trails that hugged steep ridges where a misplaced step could send a soldier tumbling into rocky valleys. The Romans prided themselves on their engineering, carving straight lines across landscapes, but Britannia often refused such impositions. Roads built by Roman labor encountered bogs that swallowed foundations, hills too steep to cut through cleanly, and valleys that flooded during seasonal rains. Yet the physical challenges of the land were only part of what unsettled the soldiers. Britannia held an atmosphere of ancientness that felt different from the wilderness of Germania. Where the Germanic forests felt vast and alive, the highlands felt old, not merely in age but in presence, as though the land itself had memories. Roman historians noted that the Celts believed in spirits that inhabited hills, rivers, and stones. And though Roman soldiers did not share these beliefs, they could not ignore the sense that the land had been shaped by rituals older than any Roman deity. Stone circles, some small and some expansive, appeared on hilltops or in valleys, their arrangements deliberate but mysterious. Roman observers recorded these structures, unsure whether they were sacred sites, meeting places, or remnants of cultures that had vanished long before the Celts themselves walked the highlands. Rumors of Druids deepened the soldiers' apprehension. Roman writers described Druids as priests, judges, healers, and keepers of ancient knowledge, their authority woven through the spiritual life of Celtic communities. They were said to understand the hidden paths better than any warrior, to move through the mists with a familiarity that made them seem part of the land itself. Though some Roman accounts exaggerated their abilities, soldiers entering Britannia felt genuine unease at the thought of facing people who knew the highlands with such precision. The idea that Druids could vanish into fog-covered hills, reappear miles away, or perform rites within sacred groves unseen by Roman eyes, added to the sense that the land held secrets too subtle for outsiders to grasp. Even the vegetation contributed to this impression. Heather stretched across the uplands in thick lavender-colored patches, swaying softly in the wind. Grasslands extended for miles without interruption, broken only by clusters of boulders left by ancient glaciers. Low, twisted trees grew in windswept shapes near higher elevations. Streams cut through the landscape with surprising speed, fed by rainfall that seemed nearly constant. The overall effect was a world shaped by natural rhythms that predated Rome by millennia. Soldiers marching through such terrain felt small, not insignificant as individuals, but humbled by the vastness and age of the land. In the evenings, when the mist finally lifted and campfires flickered against the darkening hills, the atmosphere shifted again. The wind carried scents of wet earth, distant smoke, and growing vegetation. But it also carried silence, a deep quiet that settled heavily around the camp. Unlike the forests of Germania, where animals called through the night, the highlands often fell still after dusk. This stillness could be calming, But to soldiers far from home, it sometimes felt unsettling, as though the land watched them quietly from the surrounding hills. During these nights, the soldiers reflected on the stories passed down through the ranks. They remembered accounts of the Celts launching sudden attacks from fog-covered ridges, using their knowledge of the terrain to strike quickly before disappearing back into the landscape. They recalled how Julius Caesar had written of the Druids' influence, and how later Roman commanders struggled to fully subdue Britannia despite their military strength. These memories blended with the present environment, creating a quiet tension that settled deep in the soldiers' minds. Yet the fear in Britannia was not one of constant battle, but of uncertainty. Uncertainty about what lay ahead, uncertainty about where the next path might lead, uncertainty about what the mist might conceal. It was a fear shaped not by confrontation, but by the landscape itself. A slow-building unease that tested the endurance of even the most seasoned legionaries. And as the soldiers marched onward, the highlands opened into broader plains and rolling terrains that eventually gave way to the distant, dry wind of the eastern deserts, where an entirely different kind of challenge awaited them. The lingering mists of Britannia stayed with the legionaries long after the last traces of Celtic highlands faded behind them, as though the moisture had worked its way into their bones and refused to leave. Even as they marched through drier regions, some men swore they still felt faint droplets on their cheeks or heard distant echoes of unseen footsteps crossing fog-shrouded ridges. Yet as the climate shifted, the memories of damp soil and ghostly silhouettes began to seem like dreams, soft, wet, and distant. The path ahead led them into a world that could not have been more different. A world where fog was replaced by blinding light, where hidden paths were replaced by infinite openness, and where the air itself felt like a silent adversary. And so the legions moved gradually south and east, feeling each step pull them further from the familiar dangers of the forested north, and closer to a new kind of threat, one shaped not by trees or shadows but by heat, thirst, and the unsettling vastness of the desert. They noticed the change slowly at first. The air became thinner and drier. The breezes no longer carried the scent of wet grass but the faint whisper of dust. Rivers grew more narrow, the vegetation thinner, and even the sky seemed paler, washed out by relentless sunlight. Roman soldiers who had spent years in the moist climates of the western provinces felt the dryness scratch at their throats, leaving them coughing more often than speaking. The land flattened into long stretches of pale earth, and the horizon stretched further each day, until it felt less like a boundary and more like an invitation to be lost. When they reached Antioch, the great eastern jewel of the empire, they expected vibrancy to lift their spirits, but even the city, with its bustling markets and proud mosaics, could not undo the growing unease that clung to the column. Antioch was grand, yes, but it was also a gateway, a threshold into lands where Roman power softened, where Roman maps grew uncertain, where Roman soldiers had vanished without a trace. The veterans knew what the recruits did not yet comprehend. Beyond Antioch began a world shaped by sun and emptiness, a landscape that demanded more from a soldier than armor and discipline. And so with tightened straps, filled waterskins, and restless hearts, they began the march toward the deserts of Syria. The moment they stepped beyond the last cultivated fields, the land seemed to fall away behind them like a closing door. The noise of civilization faded into a stillness so complete it felt unnatural. Even breathing sounded louder. The sand gave beneath their feet, absorbing every sound of marching boots until their own footsteps felt ghostly and weightless. The sun rose with a clarity that left no place to hide. Its light struck bronze helmets and turned them scorching hot within minutes. Soldiers wrapped cloth beneath their armor and around their helmets, improvising protections not taught in military manuals. Shields became burdens not because of their weight, but because the wood grew so hot it burned palms through the straps. Here there were no forests to conceal an ambush, no mist to disguise a hidden path, no hills to break the distance. Instead, the danger grew from the openness itself. The desert offered total visibility, yet no certainty. A distant cloud of dust could be wind, or an animal, or a Parthian cavalry unit moving silently across the plains, waiting for the moment to strike. The horizon wavered like a living thing, bending and twisting under shimmering heat, turning even the most straightforward march into a battle against perception. A soldier could stare ahead for hours and still not reach what looked like a nearby ridge, time distorted with distance, and distance distorted with heat. Then came the mirages. The first appeared on the third day, a shimmering lake stretching across the horizon with perfect clarity, its surface rippling under the sun. Some of the younger recruits inhaled sharply, convinced salvation lay ahead. Their hands twitched toward their water skins. A few even stepped forward involuntarily, as though their bodies had responded before their minds caught up. Only the veterans kept their pace steady, their eyes narrowed not in hope, but in anticipation of disappointment. They had heard of these illusions. Some had seen them long before. They didn't stop marching, but their expressions hardened, and when a shift in the wind dissolved the lake into bare sand and distant dunes, even the bravest recruits felt something go still inside them. The desert was not merely barren, it was treacherously deceptive. Nights brought no comfort. The temperature fell too quickly, turning heat into a biting chill. Sleep came in fragments. Winds slid across the ground with a haunting hum, carrying sand that tapped lightly against tents. Some soldiers woke, believing they heard footsteps beyond the perimeter, soft, measured, deliberate. Sometimes it was only the wind, but other nights faint hoofprints were found at dawn, circling the camp like a warning. The Parthians, the masters of these lands, were watching. They moved like shadows across the desert, skilled horse archers who could strike at full speed, unleash a deadly hail of arrows, and vanish before the Romans could even raise their shields. Stories of Carrhae still traveled through the ranks, stories of how entire legions were wiped out in open desert, how the heat drained their strength, how the arrows came from nowhere, and how Roman formations so powerful in forests and fields seemed useless under a sun that felt like a constant blade. And then came the sandstorm. It arrived not with warning but with a low, distant rumble that the men at first mistook for marching feet. A brown wall formed on the horizon, rising higher and higher, until it looked like a living mountain racing toward them. Officers shouted orders as men scrambled to cover their faces, secure their wagons, and brace their tents. But nothing could truly prepare them for the violence of the storm. When it struck, the world dissolved instantly into roaring wind and stinging sand. Visibility dropped to nothing. Men could not see the person beside them. The storm ripped at cloaks, tore at tent ropes, and pushed soldiers off their feet. Sand found its way into eyes, ears, mouths, armor joints, everywhere. The very ground seemed to shift beneath them as dunes reshaped themselves in moments. The wind screamed like a living creature, drowning out commands and scattering any sense of direction. When the storm finally died hours later, the silence that returned felt unnatural, as though the world were catching its breath. The landscape had transformed. Familiar markers were gone. The dunes had shifted into unrecognizable shapes. Some supply crates had vanished, and then there were the tracks, fresh hoofprints near the edges of the camp, not Roman. They traced a wide arc, evidence that riders had come close during the storm, close enough to watch, to assess, perhaps even to surround them. The realization settled heavily into every soldier's mind. Even nature itself conspired with their unseen enemy. As the march resumed, a deeper understanding took root among the men. In the forests of Germania, the danger had hidden between shadows. In the highlands of Britannia, it had drifted with fog and whispered through unseen paths. But here, in the vast and indifferent desert of Syria, the enemy was not just the Parthians, swift, skilled, and ghost-like. The enemy was the land itself, a realm that cared nothing for the strength or pride of Rome. It offered no shelter, no mercy, no warning. It swallowed the careless and punished the confident. It taught lessons not with claws or arrows, but with thirst, heat, and silence. And as the legions pressed deeper into that boundless ocean of sand, Each man understood a truth he could never have imagined in the green lands of the West. The desert was a force Rome could never fully conquer, and each step forward was an act of defiance against a landscape that demanded respect, fear, and humility in equal measure. The desert of Syria slowly gave way to lands that were at once more forgiving and more threatening in ways the soldiers could not fully anticipate. After weeks of relentless heat and endless horizons, the column of legionaries finally approached the fertile fringes of North Africa, a region the Romans knew as Numidia, where the arid edge of the Sahara met rolling plains and sudden rises of stone that marked the beginning of more varied terrain. To the veterans, this change should have been welcome. Shade returned in the form of scrub trees and scattered hills, the ground beneath their sandals became less treacherous, and the wind softened, no longer carrying the abrasive sharpness of pure sand. Yet, this new landscape had its own subtle, insidious ways of unsettling the soldiers, and the unease they carried from the eastern deserts did not diminish. It only deepened in complexity. Numidia stretched out as a wide, open expanse that invited the eye to wander, but it also invited danger. The land was dotted with low mountains, cliffs, and mesas rising abruptly from the plains, the bases of which were covered in scrub, thorn bushes, and small, twisted trees, whose shadows moved across the earth with the rhythm of the sun. The Romans learned quickly that these sudden elevations were ideal hiding places for enemy forces. Scouts moving ahead of the main column would often report traces of movement that could not be verified, footprints half buried in the soil, broken branches, or the flash of something moving just beyond a rise. Numidian warriors accustomed to their own terrain could launch attacks from these vantage points with remarkable efficiency. The soldiers knew that, unlike in the forests of Germania, where dense trees provided concealment but slowed movement, here the open plains offered no protection for those who marched in long lines, while the hills gave attackers both visibility and cover. Every glance across the horizon could reveal nothing, or everything, depending on the angle and light. The nights brought an entirely different set of challenges. The daytime heat, oppressive and unrelenting, gave way to sudden, almost violent drops in temperature. Men who had endured long days under the blazing sun now shivered beneath blankets that did little to hold warmth. The thin air carried both a strange clarity and a disorienting chill, allowing the slightest sounds to echo across the plains. Wolves and hyenas, scavenging creatures accustomed to the fringes of human habitation, moved with soft, predatory grace. Their calls at night, sharp and intermittent, reminded the soldiers of the constant presence of wild animals, creatures that could approach unnoticed and strike with lethal efficiency. Even insects played their part in the growing discomfort. Swarms of gnats and sandflies, so numerous that they were said to obscure vision, settled over skin and armor, bringing relentless irritation and carrying diseases unknown to the men of northern Italy. It was not only wildlife that threatened them. The transition from desert to plains introduced new environmental risks. Malaria-bearing mosquitoes bred in small pockets of water left by seasonal rains. Water sources that seemed clear could carry illnesses that struck suddenly, incapacitating even the strongest soldiers, and the combination of heat exertion and poor nutrition made illness spread through the ranks faster than any enemy strike. Roman commanders grew wary of leaving too long in any single location, knowing that the land could claim lives even without a single blade or arrow fired. The soldiers themselves developed routines to minimize exposure, limiting water loss, marching in shifts to avoid direct sunlight, and sleeping in carefully chosen clearings. Yet even these precautions could not guarantee safety. Traveling along the edges of the Sahara and through Numidian plains, the Romans also began to confront the psychological weight of the landscape. The desert's emptiness had taught them one kind of fear, a fear born of exposure and unrelenting monotony. Numidia introduced a new anxiety, a fear rooted in contrast. The fertile land, the scattered forests and the jagged hills presented opportunities for concealment and surprise. Where the desert forced observation, the plains allowed it to be deceived. It was a subtle lesson that made men keep their heads lowered even as they moved in formations designed for visibility, and it forced constant vigilance, for every dune, every outcropping, every shadow could conceal an enemy's spear or sword. In the absence of clear signals of danger, the soldiers' imaginations filled in gaps with every conceivable threat. Centuries later, historians would note that it was not only the strength of Numidian warriors or the sharpness of their javelins that inspired fear, but the very way the land allowed for such effortless and unexpected ambushes. Water became a preoccupation, unlike any the soldiers had experienced before. Sources were scarce and unpredictable. Some springs, mapped on Roman charts, had dried or been redirected by local use. Wells dug into the sand or clay often produced only brackish water, tasting faintly of minerals that could unsettle the stomach. Camp layouts became exercises in both logistics and survival, for the Romans knew that a shortage of water could lead to chaos as quickly as any enemy attack. The very act of drinking was measured, rationed, and deliberate. Soldiers learned to carry water in shifts, to wet the cloths over their heads rather than drink more than a few sips at a time, to conserve energy and protect themselves from the combination of heat and exertion. Even in the night, the distant memory of thirst haunted them, making sleep shallow and restless, as if their minds anticipated the next wave of exposure before it arrived. The fauna of Numidia, while less immediately threatening than predators, carried its own silent danger. Venomous snakes, scorpions, and spiders were commonplace. Soldiers were instructed to examine every sleeping area carefully, to keep fires burning as deterrents, and to remain alert even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. Roman manuals later referenced these risks, but for those marching through the frontier at the time, the combination of heat, wild creatures, and unseen enemies created a tension that was both constant and inescapable. Every movement, adjusting armor, fetching water, or even simply stepping off the path, carried the potential for harm, either from the environment or from local warriors taking advantage of the terrain. As the soldiers moved deeper into Numidia, the horizon often appeared deceptively calm. Gentle hills or low mountains provided vantage points that, if approached from the wrong direction, could hide ambushes for miles around. Even scouts, skilled and vigilant, could not always interpret the subtle disturbances in sand or foliage that betrayed hidden watchers. The open plains themselves seemed indifferent, stretching outward to infinity, but their neutrality masked deadly possibilities. For the Roman soldier trained to calculate distance and anticipate enemy movement, the combination of openness and concealment in the same landscape was particularly disorienting. It forced the mind to remain constantly alert, combining learned tactics with improvisation, and leaving little room for the complacency that often accompanies long marches in familiar lands. Disease and fatigue compounded the sense of danger. Malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses spread through the ranks quietly, striking men who had survived ambushes and heat alike. Legionaries watched their comrades grow pale and lethargic, noting how even a single infection could threaten the stability of an entire cohort. The combination of physical exhaustion, environmental stress, and the ever-present possibility of attack created a mental burden that weighed heavily on the soldiers' minds. Every day, the horizon, the hills, and the distant plains reminded them of what could happen if vigilance slipped for even a moment. A sudden charge from unseen warriors, a poisoned spring, a hidden snake in the sand, a wave of disease sweeping silently through the camp. By night, the frontier took on an even more unsettling character. The plains stretched into darkness, and the gentle rise and fall of hills concealed the shapes of creatures both real and imagined. Fires cast flickering shadows across the land, providing a fragile sense of comfort while simultaneously highlighting the isolation of the camp. The wind carried whispers through the scrub, sounds that could be mistaken for footsteps or the rustle of hidden enemies. Soldiers slept lightly, keeping their weapons close and their eyes half open, listening to the subtle movements around them, fearing ambush not from distant armies alone, but from the very land itself. And yet, even in the oppressive heat, the sparse mountains, and the shadowed nights, there was a strange rhythm to life on the frontier. The soldiers adapted. They learned to read the horizon in ways that no map could teach. They measured the wind, counted the animals, followed the subtle tracks of both man and beast. And still, as they pushed forward, they carried the awareness that Numidia and the edges of the Sahara were not only a place of passage, they were a test. A place where the empire's strength was measured, not by victories in battle, but by resilience against climate, disease, and the subtle cunning of the land itself. Every march across these plains, every night beside the flickering campfire, reinforced the lesson in the frontier. The world itself was as formidable an adversary as any human opponent. After enduring the unpredictable extremes of the African frontier, the soldiers carried with them a hardened awareness of the world's diversity, yet even this experience could not prepare them for the vast, unpredictable lands north of the Danube. The river itself marked a threshold, an invisible line separating the order and structure of the empire from regions where Roman authority wavered, and where the landscape seemed to conspire with the inhabitants to challenge every expectation. For centuries the Danube had served as a natural boundary, a barrier not only of water but of culture, climate, and countless unnamed dangers that the soldiers learned to respect almost instinctively. Beyond its waters lay forests, plains, and marshes inhabited by tribes whose reputations had been carried across the empire through rumor, intelligence reports, and the occasional harrowing encounter that survived in the annals of the legions. These names, Dacians, Sarmatians, and others, were spoken quietly in the mess tents at night, their qualities exaggerated by distance yet grounded in terrifying reality. They were warriors whose weapons, tactics, and knowledge of their own lands made them formidable adversaries, even against disciplined Roman cohorts. The first thing the legionaries noticed upon arriving at the limes, the fortified border along the Danube, was the psychological weight of waiting. Unlike the deserts of Syria, where the threat came from extreme environmental conditions combined with elusive Parthian cavalry, the Danube frontier introduced a sense of immediacy to danger. The river itself was a formidable obstacle, wide and cold, its currents unpredictable in every season. Soldiers stationed along its banks quickly realized that it was not just a boundary line, but a stage on which anything could happen without warning. Boat patrols, scouting parties, and outposts were standard, yet even the most vigilant detachments could not anticipate sudden attacks or the movement of enemy forces exploiting every curve of the river. Rumors of the tribe's capabilities traveled faster than soldiers could march. The Dacians, known for their use of the falx, a curved weapon designed to pierce armor, were particularly feared. Roman accounts described how the weapon could reach over the shields of soldiers and inflict lethal wounds, even against disciplined formations. These tales, carried from veterans of campaigns decades earlier, were not mere exaggeration. Archaeological findings confirm the presence of such curved blades, designed to exploit weaknesses in Roman defensive tactics. The psychological impact of knowing an enemy wielded tools specifically capable of breaching the very armor meant to protect them created a constant underlying tension. Soldiers adjusted their formations, holding shields higher, doubling the layers of defense, and rehearsing maneuvers that would be necessary to counter a falx's reach. Yet the fear lingered. It could never be entirely dispelled, because the weapon was only one part of a larger, more unpredictable threat. Equally unsettling were the Sarmatians, nomadic horsemen, whose speed and precision made them the scourge of any who relied on stationary lines of defense. They moved in unpredictable waves across open terrain, appearing suddenly, striking with deadly accuracy, and disappearing before retaliation could be organized. Unlike the organized legions, whose strength lay in cohesion, discipline, and formations perfected over centuries, these mounted warriors depended on mobility, knowledge of the land, and unconventional tactics. Roman scouts often returned with accounts of encampments discovered abandoned, with no trace of the enemy but signs that they had been present mere hours before. The Sarmatians' expertise in archery, combined with their speed on horseback, created a fear that was as much mental as it was physical. Soldiers learned that no amount of armor, planning, or training could fully neutralize the threat posed by foes who controlled the pace and distance of battle. Winter, however, introduced a threat that required neither enemy weapon nor skill. The Danube, swollen by seasonal rains and snowmelt, could freeze unpredictably, creating deceptive surfaces over treacherous currents. Legionaries stationed along the limes were familiar with the pattern of seasonal floods, yet each winter arrived with the potential for surprise. Sudden snowstorms could obscure visibility, chill the body beyond endurance, and isolate units from one another. Stories circulated of patrols lost in whiteouts, separated from the main force, only to reappear days later, frost-bitten, exhausted, and carrying tales of enemy ambushes that may or may not have occurred. Even when no battle was imminent, the environment itself demanded vigilance. The psychological strain of waiting, watching, and preparing for both human and natural threats created a persistent tension, one that gnawed at men accustomed to the predictability of Roman order. The forests along the river presented their own subtle threats. Unlike the open highlands of Britannia or the deserts of Syria, these wooded regions were a mixture of dense undergrowth, marshy edges, and uneven terrain. Trees crowded together in ways that blocked sightlines while leaving narrow corridors that could be exploited by skilled scouts or raiders. Rustling branches, snapping twigs, and the occasional sight of distant movement created an atmosphere of constant alertness. Even routine activities, gathering wood, repairing fortifications, or patrolling the riverbank, were fraught with potential danger. The soldiers quickly learned that inaction could be just as deadly as direct engagement, because the tribe's knowledge of their own lands allowed them to strike when least expected, using ambush and retreat with devastating effect. Illness also remained a persistent concern. The Danube's climate, unlike the arid or northern regions they had crossed previously, was damp and variable. Soldiers exposed to sudden temperature changes often suffered from respiratory illnesses. Water sources, though plentiful compared to the desert, were sometimes stagnant or contaminated, carrying diseases that could sweep through a cohort in a matter of days. Combined with the fatigue of constant patrols and the mental strain of anticipating both ambushes and environmental hazards, the health of the legions was in a delicate balance. Commanders became meticulous about hygiene, rotation of duty, and rationing of resources. But even the most careful precautions could not eliminate the pervasive anxiety that characterized life along the limes. In this environment, rumors and tales carried an outsized weight. A scout's report of a distant movement could ripple through the ranks for days, influencing patrol patterns, camp layouts, and even morale. Stories of fallen legions, lost supply trains, and sudden attacks traveled faster than intelligence reports, sometimes exaggerating events, but always reinforcing the perception that danger was omnipresent. Soldiers learned to balance skepticism with caution, trusting experience while acknowledging that the unknown often outweighed what they could measure or anticipate. The psychological landscape, as much as the physical one, defined life on the Danube frontier. Over time, the constant vigilance and mental strain shaped the men as much as the environment. Soldiers developed heightened awareness, capable of detecting subtle shifts in wind, sound, and movement that would escape those untrained. Yet even the most experienced centurions acknowledged that no level of discipline could completely remove the element of fear. The combination of skilled tribes, deceptive terrain, harsh winters, and invisible threats created a tension that was ever present, shaping every patrol, every formation, and every march. The Danube frontier became a proving ground not only for Roman military skill, but for endurance, perception, and the capacity to live continuously with the knowledge that danger was never distant, never hypothetical, but always immediate and unpredictable. In this way, the frontier north of the Danube became a world unto itself. It was a land of contrasts, wide rivers and narrow forests, freezing winters and sudden floods, disciplined legions and unpredictable enemies. Here, as in Germania, Britannia, Syria and Numidia, The soldiers confronted forces beyond their control. The Dacians' Volkses, the Sarmatians' cavalry, the hidden ambushes, and the harsh winters all created a psychological terrain as demanding as the physical one. And as the soldiers settled into routines of vigilance, patrol, and survival, they carried with them a growing understanding that in the vast reaches of the empire, the most formidable adversary was often not the legions of another state, but the combination of land, climate, and the human capacity for cunning, forces that tested the body, mind, and spirit equally, shaping the Roman soldier into someone capable of enduring what few others could imagine. After long months stationed along the Danube, where the icy river, hidden ambushes, and the unpredictable winters of the north tested both body and spirit, the Roman soldiers carried with them a quiet, almost private arsenal that was not forged from iron or leather, but from belief, ritual, and habit. Even the most hardened veterans, men who had marched from the green forests of Germania to the edge of the Sahara, found that no amount of discipline, training, or tactical preparation could completely quiet the anxiety that arose when facing unfamiliar lands, distant enemies, or the indifferent cruelty of nature. In response, each soldier developed routines and practices that were personal, often silent, and yet shared across the legions in subtle, almost invisible ways. These were the superstitions they packed with them, as essential to survival as food, water, or weapons. Every soldier carried charms or amulets, small tokens fashioned from materials both ordinary and sacred. These could be simple objects, carved from bone, wood, or stone, inscribed with marks that were meaningful only to the bearer, or perhaps with symbols known to be protective, blessed by priests or magicians of Rome. Soldiers believed that such items could shield them from harm, deflect arrows, or appease spirits they had not fully understood. Some wore pendants of animals considered powerful or sacred, such as wolves, lions, or eagles. Others kept miniature statuettes of gods, including Mars, Mercury, or Jupiter, tucked into pouches tied at the belt or sewn into the linings of cloaks. The objects were small enough to be carried without encumbering a man on a long march, yet their presence offered a psychological anchor, a reminder that beyond the cold river, the shifting fog, or the endless desert, unseen forces might still provide protection. Prayer was another companion to fear. Soldiers would bow their heads in silence when waking before dawn, when leaving a camp, or when crossing a river whose current seemed particularly threatening. These prayers were never loud or ostentatious. The legions were practical, and superstition was personal, but it was widespread. A soldier might whisper a request to Fortuna for safe passage, murmur thanks to Ceres for food and water, or invoke the protection of Sol during the unrelenting heat of the eastern deserts. The words themselves were less important than the act. The motion of hands raised, lips moving in secret devotion, and the rhythm of repeated gestures that, over days and weeks, formed a quiet, stabilizing pattern in the soldiers' lives. Even when no tangible effect could be seen, the rituals helped steady nerves, ease the tension of constant vigilance, and provide a sense of continuity amid an ever-changing landscape. Dreams were taken seriously, especially after months in foreign lands where danger was pervasive and often invisible. Soldiers discussed their dreams cautiously, sharing stories of visions that foretold encounters with enemies, of omens appearing in sleep, or of impossible journeys through fog, sand, or icy rivers. These dreams shaped expectations, influenced decisions, and sometimes dictated the choice of routes, camp locations, or even who would lead scouting parties. A dream was rarely interpreted alone. Its significance was weighed against omens observed during the day, the patterns of the natural world, and the advice of comrades. The legions, disciplined as they were, recognized that the mind's warnings were sometimes as valuable as any formal report. Omens played a quiet but pervasive role in the psychological landscape of the soldiers. The flight of birds, the sudden appearance of snakes, the unexpected fall of objects, or the flicker of light through clouds could all be interpreted as signs. Legionaries learned to notice patterns, subtle deviations from expectation that might indicate danger or protection. Such observations, though informal, created a web of guidance that helped the men navigate both the visible and invisible hazards of their environment. In forests, across deserts, or along the cold waters of the Danube, soldiers observed these omens with a mixture of skepticism and reverence, understanding that their survival often depended as much on vigilance and intuition as on swordsmanship or strategy. The personal routines associated with these beliefs were deeply intertwined with the physical experience of marching. Before sleeping, men might draw simple symbols in the sand or dirt near their tent, a fleeting invocation of protection. They might fold garments or shields in a prescribed order, not only for neatness but as a ritual to keep order in a world that often seemed chaotic. Water taken from streams might be touched with the hand to bless it before drinking, a subtle gesture acknowledging that even sustenance was a gift that needed careful reception. Meals themselves could become moments of reflection, brief pauses in which men silently invoked gratitude or petitioned the gods for continued strength. These acts, small and repeated daily, created a rhythm that contrasted with the unpredictability of life in foreign lands, and the soldiers leaned on them as much as they did on training and discipline. Some charms and rituals were communal, forming a quiet shared culture that spanned entire legions. A unit might carry a single standard blessed by a priest, or preserve a fragment of sacred cloth or metal said to hold protective power. Soldiers would pass these objects carefully during marches or battles, ensuring that each member felt a connection to them. The presence of shared symbols offered a subtle reassurance, reinforcing cohesion and morale, especially in situations where the land, the enemy, or the climate could overwhelm individual courage. In essence, the legion's belief system was both practical and psychological, a bridge between tangible preparation and the intangible comfort of spiritual security. Even seasoned commanders, men who had faced the full spectrum of threats from the dense forests of Germania to the highlands of Britannia, from the eastern deserts to the edges of Numidia, were not immune. They carried charms in their armor, observed personal rituals, and watched omens for guidance. Their authority depended not only on tactical skill but also on the respect of their soldiers. An acknowledgement of shared beliefs created a subtle unity. When marching across unfamiliar terrain, facing tribes whose capabilities were only partially known, or contending with natural hazards that defied preparation, these small gestures, charms, and prayers became part of the invisible scaffolding that held the legion together. In moments of particular tension, these superstitions revealed their true significance. Crossing rivers swollen from unexpected rainfall, facing a sudden winter storm, or navigating a dense fog or sandstorm, soldiers would instinctively touch amulets, whisper prayers, or observe patterns that they hoped carried meaning. These acts offered a form of control, however symbolic, in a world where true control was often impossible. In lands where the enemy could strike unseen, where the climate itself was indifferent or hostile, and where disease or exhaustion could incapacitate a man as effectively as any spear, the psychological comfort provided by charms and rituals was not merely tradition, it was survival. Thus, as the legions prepared to march into new regions, across mountains, deserts, and plains, far from the comfort of Rome, their baggage included far more than food, weapons, or tools. They carried with them centuries of belief, ritual, and superstition, quietly woven into the fabric of their daily lives. These private and communal practices allowed them to confront dangers that could not be measured, predicted, or fully understood. And as they moved onward, through the unknown, across unfamiliar rivers, and over rugged landscapes, the silent strength of these superstitions became as crucial as any formation, as protective as any shield, and as constant as the rhythmic march of disciplined boots across foreign soil. After months of marching across vast deserts, fertile plains, and along rivers that divided the known from the unknown, the soldiers often found themselves stationed in far-flung fortresses, places that were less about active battle than about maintaining a presence, holding ground, and waiting. The forts were isolated by design, positioned at the edges of the empire, to serve as both watchtowers and barriers against incursions. They were often little more than stone walls encircling wooden buildings, towers rising above rough terrain, and gates that clanged loudly when opened, announcing the comings and goings of supplies or visitors. From the first glance, a new recruit might think such a place was a haven, a secure spot after long marches and dangerous terrain. But over time, the quiet of these outposts revealed itself to be a different kind of trial, one no sword or shield could fully prepare a soldier to endure. Life within these forts was defined by routine, repetition, and long stretches of waiting. Days passed in measured cycles, inspection of walls, maintenance of equipment, patrols around the perimeter, and when necessary, the occasional skirmish with small raiding parties or bandits. Yet the vast majority of time was consumed by the slow, almost imperceptible ticking of hours that seemed to stretch indefinitely. Meals were simple, water was rationed, and every action carried a faint echo of monotony. The soldiers learned to fill their days with small tasks, organizing supplies, repairing roofs, carving symbols or messages into the wooden walls, and keeping meticulous records of arrivals and departures. These activities, though practical, could never entirely banish the oppressive weight of isolation, the creeping sense of being removed from the pulse of the empire, and the growing awareness that the soldiers were alone, often for weeks or months at a time, at the very edge of Roman authority. The nights in these forts were particularly profound in their quiet. As the sun dipped below distant hills or forests, long shadows stretched across the courtyards, and the wind carried distant noises, sometimes animal calls, sometimes the rustle of leaves, sometimes the haunting echo of footsteps from the surrounding wilderness. Sleep was often shallow, broken by the awareness of the fortress's vulnerability. Patrols moved along walls and watchtowers, lanterns casting trembling light onto stone surfaces, and soldiers whispered in hushed tones about events from months or years past, or about rumors of movements in lands far beyond their sight. Even seasoned veterans could feel unease creeping in, not from immediate danger, but from the slow accumulation of distance, the perception that time itself had been stretched thin by isolation, and that Rome might, in some distant way, forget them. Supplies arrived slowly, often unpredictably, making rationing a matter of constant concern. Food, once stored carefully in granaries, could spoil or attract pests. Water, sourced from distant wells or streams, was rationed with meticulous attention. The arrival of a wagon from a central supply line became a day of celebration, brief relief, and a temporary reprieve from the ever-present anxiety. Letters from home were rare, delayed by weeks or months, and their absence fed the sense of disconnection. A man could spend a lifetime in such a fortress and feel as though the pulse of civilization, its cities, its streets, its markets, its senate, existed only in memory, flickering faintly across the imagination, like a distant light, barely visible across fog or distance. The psychological weight of these isolated positions manifested in quiet, creeping fears. Soldiers worried not only about attacks from beyond the walls, but about the more subtle threats, desertion, illness, boredom, and the slow erosion of morale. Desertion was rarely a practical option, given the isolation, the surrounding wilderness, and the discipline enforced within the fort. Yet the thought lingered in idle conversations. A man might dream of slipping away under the cover of darkness, wandering into forests, across rivers, or down mountain paths, searching for civilization or for freedom. Illness, too, was insidious. Minor infections could spread rapidly, medical care was limited, and the combination of isolation and limited supplies could turn a small problem into a life-threatening situation. The very act of existing within the walls became a delicate balance of vigilance and endurance, a continuous test of mental fortitude. The landscape surrounding these forts often added to the sense of alienation. Rolling hills, distant peaks, forests and marshes created a patchwork that seemed endless. On clear days, soldiers could see mountains rising far in the distance, rivers snaking like silver threads, and forests spreading into green or brown expanses. Yet no matter how far the eye traveled, the world beyond the walls felt simultaneously vast and unreachable. The perception of distance created an enduring tension, a reminder that help could not arrive quickly, that reinforcements were days or weeks away, and that the small garrisons within the fort were truly the first, and sometimes only, line of defense against whatever might come from beyond the visible horizon. The slow seasons imposed their own rhythm. Winter brought cold that seeped into stone walls, penetrating even well-built fortifications, making nights long and bitter. Soldiers huddled around small fires, sharing stories, quietly reading letters or texts, or simply staring into flames as their minds drifted. Spring and summer, while warmer, brought mosquitoes, heat, and the relentless march of time that seemed to stretch each day into an eternity. Every season carried its own challenges, and with each passing month, the psychological strain of the outpost accumulated in ways that were subtle yet profound. The soldiers became intimately aware of the power of monotony, the weight of stillness, and the oppressive nature of distance from home and from the centers of Roman power. Over time, these quiet fears of boredom, of being forgotten, of illness, of isolation, became intertwined with the soldiers' sense of duty. Every patrol, every watch, every task, however small, assumed a heightened significance. The fort was not only a physical structure, but a symbol of Roman presence and control, and the men stationed there were its guardians. Yet they were also participants in a delicate psychological balance, maintaining morale for themselves and for the unit, while enduring the persistent awareness that the wider empire could not always intervene on their behalf. Rome existed elsewhere, in cities of marble and markets, in administrative halls and distant theaters of war. Here at the edge, the fort felt like the very limit of civilization, a thin, human-constructed boundary between order and the indifferent wild beyond. And in that quiet, under the endless stars or the low light of winter dawn, the soldiers often contemplated the strange duality of their existence. They were isolated yet connected, vulnerable yet powerful, part of a vast empire yet removed from its daily pulse. Their fears were subtle, quiet, and pervasive, the fear of monotony, of being overlooked, of the slow decay of both body and spirit in the absence of challenge or recognition. Yet it was precisely this quiet trial that shaped them, honed their patience, strengthened their bonds, and deepened their understanding of what it meant to serve Rome at its farthest edges. In the loneliness of far-flung fortresses, the soldiers learned endurance, subtle vigilance, and the art of surviving not through immediate confrontation, but through quiet, continuous presence, a test of mind, body, and soul that no battlefield could replicate. Even within the relative security of their forts, and even after enduring the isolation and challenges of distant frontiers, Roman soldiers found that some of their greatest adversaries were neither enemies nor the elements, but memory and imagination. The mind, left to wander in the quiet hours of night, or in the slow monotony of a long march, became a terrain as treacherous and unpredictable as any forest, desert, or river they had crossed. It was here, in the space between recollection and anticipation, that fear took on its most persistent and intimate form. The memories they carried etched deeply into the muscles, the nerves, and the very rhythm of their footsteps, intertwined seamlessly with rumor, legend, and half-forgotten tales from comrades long gone, creating a psychological landscape in which danger was never fully absent. Stories of past disasters haunted the legions as they moved across the empire. Teutoburg Forest, an event decades past but alive in the collective memory of every soldier who served in the northern provinces, was recounted in quiet tones beside campfires, in tents, and along rivers. Entire legions, it was said, had vanished in that dense woodland, overwhelmed by an enemy who knew every bend, every tree, every slope better than the disciplined formations that marched blindly into their trap. Even men who had never been near Germania felt the echo of that catastrophe. They carried in their minds the image of Roman cohorts cut down amid trees, the cries of men muffled by mist and soil, and the collapse of command as fear rippled through lines trained to obey. The horror was not only historical, it was instructive. Every step into unfamiliar terrain, Every patrol through unknown forests carried the implicit question, could history repeat itself here, in these lands now stretched out at the edge of the empire? Similarly, memories of Parthian disasters in the east, the ambushes, the relentless cavalry, the invisible arrows raining from a distance, resurfaced unbidden. The men had endured mirages, sandstorms, and the merciless sun, but the mental replay of Parthian tactics, whispered warnings from veteran officers, and maps sketched hastily with past losses marked in red, gave shape to an anxiety that no armor could ward off. Even those who had survived encounters with Eastern cavalry could not erase the impressions left by comrades lost in distant skirmishes. When the sun burned high and the sand shimmered on the horizon, it was easy for imagination to transform the waves of heat into the deceptive forms of mounted warriors appearing suddenly to strike. Beyond the immediacy of past defeats, the frontier itself seemed to breathe life into stories of the dead, the missing, and the imagined. Soldiers spoke cautiously of ghostly figures glimpsed in the forests of Germania, the highlands of Britannia, and the plains of Numidia, often attributing natural occurrences, shadows cast by wind, distant noises, or the shifting shapes of terrain to unseen observers. These accounts were rarely sensationalized in the moment, but shared quietly, always carried a measure of dread. Memory and imagination fed each other. A tale of a lost patrol could give rise to speculation of similar fates awaiting the men at hand, and imagined encounters could retroactively color recollections of real events, turning ordinary nights into something more fraught than any direct engagement. Sleep offered no real escape. Nightmares were common, drawn from both real and imagined experiences. A soldier might dream of marching into a fog-filled forest only to be surrounded by phantom legions, or hear the echo of horses and arrows before awakening with a start. Others dreamed of cliffs collapsing beneath them, rivers swelling with impossible speed, or mirages that led them endlessly across desert plains. Each dream was reinforced by the stories told by those around them, by the letters carried from home, describing distant crises, and by the silent cues of the land itself, the rustle of leaves, the crack of a distant branch, the subtle changes in wind or light. In these moments, memory and imagination converged, creating a space where fear was constant, intimate, and invisible, shaping perception in ways as real and binding as any physical threat. The soldier's mental landscape was further complicated by rumor, which flowed through the ranks with the subtle force of a river under ice. Some rumors concerned distant campaigns, attacks that had taken place decades earlier, legions lost, generals killed, and cities burned. Others were tales of local enemies, Dacians, Sarmatians, or Numidian warriors, whose capabilities were magnified by storytelling into near-mythic proportions. Facts merged with speculation, observation with exaggeration, and soon the borderlands were populated with creatures and warriors who seemed larger, faster, and more lethal than reality could justify. The mind, conditioned by repeated exposure to danger, accepted these blended narratives as part of its anticipation, making even ordinary patrols seem fraught with peril, and every shadow a potential signal of an approaching attack. This fusion of memory and imagination had practical effects as well. Scouts became hyper-vigilant, eyes constantly scanning tree lines and hills. Centurions adjusted formations and marching patterns, not only based on maps or intelligence, but also in response to subtle cues from those who had endured past defeats. Orders were given to inspect terrain with a meticulousness born of experience and a persistent sense of what might go wrong. At times, this heightened awareness saved lives. At others, it exhausted the men, leaving them tense, jumpy, and prone to fatigue. The frontier demanded this tension as much as it demanded stamina or strength, for the psychological landscape shaped reactions and readiness as much as any spear or shield. Even in quiet moments when the sun hung low in the sky, or the wind moved silently through distant forests and plains, memory and imagination remained active. Men would pause at riversides or hilltops, recalling tales of ambush, loss, and survival. They imagined the movements of enemies they had never seen, projected historical defeats onto present circumstances, and felt the subtle hum of fear in their own muscles. These anticipatory fears were not irrational, for the frontier was unpredictable, and history had proven time and again that caution was prudent. Yet the interplay of recollection, rumor, and fantasy created a persistent tension that could not be assuaged by strength, strategy, or armor. It was a quiet companion shaping the soldier's perceptions and decisions in ways both conscious and subconscious. The influence of memory and imagination extended beyond the individual. Within the cohort, stories circulated quietly, forming a collective consciousness of danger and respect for the unknown. A single veteran's account of a near-fatal encounter could ripple through the unit, affecting morale, decisions, and vigilance for weeks. Tales of past disasters became reference points, guiding choices about where to camp, how to march, and how to approach reconnaissance. Shared memories created a culture of cautious respect, blending the lessons of history with the lessons of imagination, and in doing so they transformed fear from a purely individual experience into a shared shaping force that bound the legion together even as it reminded each man of his vulnerability. Thus, at the edges of the empire, across forests, deserts, rivers, and mountains, soldiers carried more than armor, weapons, and supplies. They carried the weight of past campaigns, the stories of lost comrades, the warnings of veterans, and the echoing voice of rumor. Memory and imagination intertwined to form a psychological terrain as complex and treacherous as any physical battlefield. Here, fear was quiet, persistent, and deeply internalized. It was the product of both what had been endured and what might yet come, a constant presence that influenced perception, shaped behavior, and tempered the courage of men who had marched farther than most could imagine. And as the legions moved onward, their vigilance and endurance were not only measured by their physical actions but by their ability to navigate this intricate landscape of memory, imagination, and anticipatory fear, where the boundaries between history and rumor, reality and fantasy, blurred beneath the vast skies of the empire's frontiers. After decades of marching, patrolling, and enduring the remote edges of the empire, the road home was never direct. It twisted through lands they had once crossed as outsiders, through forests, rivers, and plains that carried both the imprint of memory and the lingering whisper of fear. Each step was heavy with experience, every mile saturated with lessons learned from distant deserts, forests, highlands, and frozen frontiers. Unlike the outward journey, when fear had been immediate and palpable, the return was a more subtle reckoning, the transformation of those fears into knowledge, habit, and memory. The body remained weary from marches, skirmishes, and long nights in isolated forts, but the mind carried a different weight now, a quieter, reflective one, tempered by survival and the endurance of countless unseen threats. As the legions moved through familiar territories once more, they noticed how much their perception of danger had evolved. The forests of Germania, which had once seemed dark and alive with hidden adversaries, were now remembered as intricate puzzles in which their discipline and vigilance had allowed them to navigate safely. The highlands of Britannia, previously enigmatic and shrouded in fog, had transformed in memory into testaments of resilience, their marshes and hidden paths now part of a mental map that no new soldier could traverse without guidance. Even the deserts of Syria, with their mirages, unrelenting sun, and endless horizons, had been reframed in the minds of the legionaries, not simply as hostile lands but as spaces where skill, preparation, and endurance had proven decisive. Each memory carried with it the duality of fear endured and fear mastered, forming the foundation of knowledge that would guide soldiers and commanders for generations. Along the journey home, discussions among soldiers became less about immediate threats and more about stories and reflections. Tales of ambushes, sudden storms, and enemies wielding falxes or arrows were recounted with a calm, measured tone, filtered through experience and time. These narratives were never purely boastful, rather they were instructive, offering guidance for those who would later take up the same path, patrol the same frontiers, and confront the same uncertainties. Fear, once urgent and consuming, had now become a tool, shaping discipline, situational awareness, and tactical thinking. The soldiers realized that each apprehension they had felt, whether at the edge of a river, within the shadow of a forest, or beneath a night sky in a distant desert, was now encoded into their movements, decisions, and the very rhythm of their marches. It was a quiet, invisible inheritance, both personal and collective, a refinement of awareness that would survive even as the soldiers themselves returned to Rome. Memories of companions lost or injured along the journey lent the return march a somber cadence. The men who had endured long campaigns had witnessed death not only in battle but in silence, through disease, exhaustion, exposure, or misfortune. These recollections were never spoken loudly, for the legions respected the weight of such experience, but they were carried in quiet gestures, a pause by a river where a comrade had fallen, the marking of a spot along a path, or the unspoken nod to a fellow soldier who had endured the same trials. Over time, these memories became intertwined with the lessons of the land itself, the hills that had concealed ambushes, the rivers that had carried hidden currents, and the plains that had tested patience and vigilance. Fear had become a narrative thread that wove together knowledge, endurance, and empathy, binding men not only to the past but to one another. The psychological landscape of the returning soldiers was further shaped by anticipation and reflection. Rome itself, though not physically distant at this point, existed as a mental destination, a symbol of rest, recognition, and a return to order. Yet the closer the legions came, the more complex their emotions became. They were eager for the safety, comfort, and structure of familiar streets and fortified walls, yet reluctant to let go entirely of the heightened awareness and discipline that had sustained them. The journey home became an exercise in balancing relief with continued attentiveness. Men remained mindful of terrain, water sources, and potential hazards, even when danger was unlikely, because the lessons of the frontier had taught that complacency could be fatal. This discipline, once driven by immediate fear, now carried the serene weight of wisdom, a reminder that vigilance need not be frantic to be effective. Stories, songs, and quiet conversation became vehicles for integrating experience into memory. At night, beside campfires, soldiers recounted skirmishes with Parthian cavalry, ambushes in the forests of Germania, or narrow escapes in the hills of Britannia. They spoke of the amulets, charms, and prayers that had sustained them, of omens observed and dreams interpreted, and of the camaraderie that had made endurance possible. Younger recruits listened carefully, absorbing the narratives not simply for entertainment, but as preparation, internalizing the subtle lessons embedded within each tale. In this way, fear was transformed. It was no longer a paralyzing or immediate force, but a foundation for strategy, discipline, and collective memory, ensuring that future legions would be shaped by the experiences of those who had come before. Even as physical exhaustion accumulated with each mile toward the heart of the empire, the soldiers' minds began to settle. The horizon, once always distant and unpredictable, gradually became familiar, dotted with towns, fortifications, and the gentle rise and fall of landscapes they had known or imagined in childhood stories. The rhythm of marching, once driven by the urgency of unknown threats, now carried a reflective cadence, a meditative pattern that allowed men to process the full spectrum of experience. They thought of the long nights in isolated forts, the whispers of enemies in forests and mountains, and the silent, almost invisible pressures of climate, disease, and solitude. All of it, once terrifying in the immediacy of survival, now contributed to a deep reservoir of memory, shaping not only how the soldiers would act in the future, but also who they were in the present, disciplined, alert, and profoundly aware of the fragility and resilience of life. Upon finally reaching Rome, or returning to more populous provinces along the way, the soldiers carried more than scars and calluses. They bore the imprint of landscapes and battles that stretched beyond the imagination of those who had never traveled so far. They bore knowledge distilled from fear, converted into skill, awareness, and quiet wisdom. And they bore stories that would circulate quietly among recruits, whispered in tents, sung beside fires, and recorded in accounts that blended history, legend, and observation. Fear had not been vanquished, but it had been transformed, refined into an invisible but enduring companion, a teacher whose lessons were both personal and universal, shaping men into soldiers capable of enduring what few could imagine. In these final stages, the experience of fear, endurance, and reflection merged into a tranquil, almost meditative state. The soldiers learned that the edges of the empire were more than tests of strength. They were schools of resilience, patience, and quiet observation. By the time they reached home, the full spectrum of experiences from the deserts of Syria to the icy northern rivers, from isolated forts to the highlands of Britannia, had coalesced into a continuous thread, one of survival, memory, discipline, and the subtle art of navigating both physical and psychological landscapes. The mind, once alert to every possible threat, could now relax without losing the lessons of vigilance. Stories, memories, and rituals became part of the landscape they carried within themselves, ensuring that even in rest, the wisdom of distant lands would endure. And so, as the soldiers returned to hearths, streets, and walls familiar from childhood or early training, fear settled into memory, discipline, and story. It became quiet rather than immediate, reflective rather than urgent, a companion that had shaped their journeys and would continue to guide others who walked the long roads of the empire. In this gentle, pervasive way, fear had completed its transformation from sharp and pressing to remembered and instructive, to a quiet, almost imperceptible rhythm within the life of a soldier. And with that understanding, the narrative of the frontier, the marches, the forests, the deserts, and the distant fortresses could finally settle, like dust after a long storm, into a space of calm reflection, a space in which the listener could breathe deeply, drift gently, and find repose, carrying the story as quietly into sleep as the legions carried their memories home.